As Turkish 726 cruised over the northern plains of India, the early rays of the approaching dawn were visible over the eastern horizon. The subsequent report into the events which were about to unfold never formally identified the captain, other than recognising him as a 55-year-old male with a total time of just under 15,000 hours, nearly 1,500 of which will have been gained on the A330 type. His first officer would likewise only be identified as a 47-year-old male, with a total of just over 7,600 hours, slightly more than 1,200 of which will have been attained on this aircraft type. Although he himself had previous experience of operating into Tribhuvan, his last time to operate into the airport was over 3 months ago. In contrast, the captain had never previously operated the route, and for him this would be his first approach and landing at the airport. As the long flight from Istanbul neared its end, the crew began to prepare for the upcoming descent and approach into Tribhuvan International Airport, the gateway to Nepal. Situated in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains, the airport in Kathmandu has a reputation amongst pilots as being one of the most challenging anywhere in the world. Constrained by significant terrain in the immediate area, instrument approaches into the airfield are complex, and many an aircraft and crew have met their end while attempting to navigate safe passage through the myriad of hills and valleys which abound in the area. The airport itself consists of a single paved runway of 10,000 feet in length, orientated more or less due north-south and identified as runway 0220. With its location in the foothills of the Himalayas, the threshold elevation of runway 02, the runway in use at the time of the accident, is 4,318 feet above mean sea level. Back in the cockpit of Turkish 726, in light of the complex environment surrounding the airfield, understandably the crew were anxious to establish two-way communication with Kathmandu as early as possible, in an effort to coordinate the descent and arrival. However, while still working Varanasi control and under the supervision of Indian authorities, the crew's repeated efforts to contact Kathmandu control on their second radio set proved unsuccessful. The reason was simple. On the day, Turkish 726 was running approximately 45 minutes early, and at 5:45 AM local time, Kathmandu control, not being a 24-hour facility, was only preparing to come online at 6. For this reason, it wasn't until just after 6 AM that two-way communication was established, at which time 726 was informed that early morning fog, not unusual for this part of the world, had reduced visibility at the airport to only 100 metres, and given that visibility, until such time as there was an improvement, the airport was actually closed to all arrivals. Now only 95 kilometres to the southwest, the aircraft entered the published holding pattern overhead the Parsa intersection at flight level 270, the rough equivalent of 27,000 feet, and began to wait it out for an improvement in the weather. Due to turbulence in the upper atmosphere, most probably as a result of winds off the Himalayas located to the north, 5 minutes later the crew of 726 requested and were approved to continue to the Samar intersection and again establish the published holding pattern there at the lower altitude of flight level 210. "726 remained in this holding pattern for another 43 minutes, at which time the approach controller in Kathmandu reported the visibility as having improved to 1,000 metres. The approach chart published on the day stipulated a minimum visibility requirement for the approach of 1,500 metres. However, this requirement had been set in lieu of intended work which was to be carried out on the runway, but which, as of the accident date, hadn't actually commenced. As such, prior to the flight being dispatched from Istanbul, the crew of 726 had been briefed that the true visibility requirements for the RNAV approach were only 900 metres. The crew of Turkish 726 were asked for their intentions, and the captain, in light of this new information, instructed his first officer to respond that given the reported improvements in conditions, they were now ready to commence the RNAV approach to runway 02. As the 330 continued inbound, on passing Dovan, a specific waypoint designated on the approach just over 7 miles from the threshold, the approach controller instructed the crew to contact the tower. Following a brief interaction at 7:09 local, the tower controller issued 726 with the landing clearance and reported the wind as 100 degrees 3 knots, the lightest of easterly breezes. Somewhat surprisingly, however, given the prevailing conditions at the time, the subsequent accident report failed to mention any further reference by the tower controller to the existing visibility at the field, nor, it would appear, did the crew of Turkish 726 make any further inquiry. Being navigated by the aircraft's autopilot both laterally and vertically, 726 descended through the thick fog, devoid of any outside visual reference. 700 feet above the ground, 600, 500, until finally, at 100 feet above the published minimums, the first officer as pilot monitoring attempted to visually acquire any element of the runway or approach lighting system ahead of them. Failing in his effort to do so, and still with no visual reference outside the aircraft, at 7:12 local, Turkish 726 arrived at the published minimum descent altitude, or MDA, for the approach, at 4,650 feet above sea level, or just 340 feet above the ground. The rules governing instrument flight are very clear and unambiguous in such circumstances. If no visual reference has been established with the landing runway by the time the aircraft descends to this altitude, the approach must be terminated by executing a missed approach, also known as a go-around. So, in response to the predicament they found themselves in, this is exactly what the crew of Turkish 726 did. The captain, as the pilot flying the leg, applied tow power and monitored as the automatics rotated the aircraft 15 degrees nose up into the go-round attitude. Per standard procedure, he called for retraction of the flap from configuration full to configuration 3, and having established the aircraft with a positive rate of climb, called for the landing gear to be retracted. Controlling authority was subsequently passed from the tower back to the area controller, and the aircraft was given clearance to proceed via the published misapproach procedure to the Rattan holding pattern via the Manri waypoint, and to continue its climb to 10,500 feet in order to ensure adequate terrain separation. As they climbed away from the airfield, having been unsuccessful with their first attempt to land, the crew would have become focused on managing their fuel reserves and the remaining options available to them. At 7:28, the crew requested an update on the latest visibility, with the Kathmandu approach controller reporting a general increase to 3,000 metres, with further comments being passed from the tower controller that from his position the observed conditions were looking like 1,000 metres to the southeast, with a few clouds at 1,000 feet, a scattered layer at 2,000, and another broken layer higher at 10,000 feet. Having heard the report, the crew indicated their intention to attempt a second approach, and were subsequently cleared for another RNAV approach to runway 02, with the instruction to report when overhead the Rattan intersection. At 8 miles from touchdown, Kathmandu Tower cleared the aircraft to land and provided a wind report of 160 degrees at 4 knots, a 3-knot tailwind, but still well within the limitations of the aircraft. As the 330 continued with its approach, the tower asked the crew whether they had the approach lights in sight. The crew replied that as of yet they couldn't see anything, and queried the tower controller as to whether the lights were set at full intensity. The aircraft was now just 780 feet above the ground, and no more than 60 seconds from touchdown. As on the previous approach, as the aircraft passed through 100 feet above the MDA, the first officer began to once again search for any visual element of the approach lighting system. With only seconds passing, the cockpit voice recorder at 07:43 and 30 seconds local recounted the automated minimums call from the aircraft's ground proximity warning system, indicating that for the second time the 330 had once again arrived at the published MDA. As on the first occasion, what investigators would have expected to hear on the CVR at this stage would have been a call from the FO as to whether or not visual acquisition with the runway environment had been successfully attained. If it had, and the visual perspective was deemed sufficient, the captain would have indicated his intention to continue with the landing. Where visual acquisition was unsuccessful, the call instead would have been go around, and the process of pulling up and climbing away would have been repeated. But this isn't what the investigators heard. What they did hear, just 4 seconds prior to reaching the MDA, was the first officer stating, "It will appear when we descend below." Almost simultaneously as the automated minimums call was made, the captain, possibly influenced by his first officer assessment of the situation, was clearly heard to say, "Continue to 300, which investigators took to mean that his intention was to continue the descent a little further to 300 feet above the runway. This response was non-standard, and noting the first officer's failure to articulate that he had acquired any visual reference with the airport environment, the investigation team were given reason to suspect that perhaps he had willfully descended in breach of regulation below the MDA while continuing to search for the runway. But how could they be sure? Coincidentally, at about this time, a local flight on the ground attempting to depart Kathmandu had been forced to return to the parking ramp, stating that visibility on the airfield was almost non-existent. In addition, a military guard positioned on the airport perimeter, adjacent the runway 02 threshold and directly underneath the 330's flight path, subsequently reported that despite hearing the aircraft pass overhead at very low level, he couldn't actually see it. CCTV footage from various locations around the airport showed a noticeable deterioration in the general visibility across the airfield during the 40 minutes or so between the first failed landing attempt and the second. Significantly, however, this deterioration in visibility was never brought to the crew's attention by the local tower controller. Although certainly not best practice, this fact in itself should not have resulted in the aircraft's descent below MDA. However, not being informed of such a deterioration would undoubtedly have left the crew with an unrealistic expectation of what lay ahead, having been informed previously that conditions had improved, and accepting a clearance for a second approach on that basis. Arguably, their inability to see the landing runway at MDA would have come as a surprise, and surprises tend to impact negatively, even if only temporarily, on human cognitive functioning and overall general performance. But perhaps the most damning evidence to suggest that the captain had indeed descended below the MDA without the required visual reference having been established was his comment made just 5 seconds before touchdown, where he articulated the single word, "appearing," the first suggestion by either of the crew members that the runway environment was finally coming into view. Throughout this time, the autopilot remained engaged, only finally being disengaged as the aircraft descended through a height of 14 feet above the runway surface. As the normal flare height of the A330 is approximately 30 feet, the disconnection and belated attempt to arrest the aircraft's rate of descent from just 14 feet resulted in a hard touchdown, which the flight data recorder registered at approximately 2.7 G, with a body pitch attitude of only about 1.8 degrees, in contrast to the more conventional flare attitude of between 6 and 7. But their problems didn't end there. The 330's initial touchdown was to the left of centerline, very much to the left. In fact, the left-hand main gear itself touched down some 32 metres from the runway centerline, which was actually off the paved surface and on the adjacent grass. With the grass area being soft due to recent rain, the left-hand gear immediately dug in and the aircraft veered towards the left, slowly pulling the aircraft in that direction as the rollout continued. As a result, the nose landing gear entered the grass at approximately 683 metres from the threshold of the runway, with the deviation to the left continuing and finally resulting in the right-hand main landing gear leaving the paved surface some 190 metres later. While crossing taxiway Delta, the nose landing gear collapsed and the forward part of the fuselage started dragging on the grass. The resultant change in aircraft body attitude caused both engines to contact the ground. The airport fire watchtower had been monitoring the flight's progress, although the aircraft had not been visible due to the environmental conditions. At 7:44 local, they had heard an unusual sound and accordingly alerted the fire crew on Kathmandu Tower. The tower controller subsequently made a number of calls to the aircraft, but received no immediate response. A few seconds later, the crew did initiate radio contact with the tower, asking for fire and medical assistance. On foot of this, rescue vehicles proceeded towards the runway while in contact with Kathmandu ground control, and through the fog came across the aircraft resting on the soft grass between taxiways Delta and Charlie, noting significant damage to both the airframe and engines, although generally intact with no evidence of fire. Immediately extinguishing agent was discharged, and particular foam was applied to the area of the left engine, which was leaking a considerable amount of fuel. At 0748 local, about 4 minutes after touchdown, the crew requested that stairs be brought to the aircraft to facilitate disembarkation of the passengers, rather than commencing a formal evacuation. The fire and rescue team used the ladders in their possession on the fire vehicle to open the left cabin door, but having realised the logistics of the situation, appealed to the captain through the cabin crew and attendants to deploy the evacuation slides. The request was acknowledged, and at 7:50 local, approximately 6 minutes after touchdown, the captain gave the order to deploy the slides and evacuate. With the post-flight investigation, 2 burning questions needed to be answered. In light of all the evidence, why had the crew descended below MDA without visual reference? And separately, why had the aircraft touched down so far from the centreline as to cause it to leave the paved surface? There was a suggestion that fatigue, due to the long flight through the night into a challenging, unfamiliar airfield, may have conditioned the pilots into subconsciously closing down diversion alternatives in preference to completing the landing come what may at Kathmandu, what psychologists in the field would call continuation bias. It must be stressed that initiating a diversion to an alternate airfield and radically changing one's course of action doesn't come without a considerable increase in stress and cockpit workload. Had the decision to divert have been made at any time, the first designated alternate was to be New Delhi, some 820 kilometres to the west, requiring a flight time of no less than 1 hour and 20 minutes. In preparation for an approach into Delhi, en route the crew would have had to organise necessary navigation charts, recheck destination weather, and perform necessary landing performance calculations, all while managing dwindling fuel reserves and an ever-increasing volume of traffic as they approached the Indian metropolis. Given the sheer volume of tasks which would have had to be completed, it's not unusual for one to become biased towards the path of least resistance, which in this instance may well have been the option to see through the plan which they had already subscribed to. Indeed, as if to solidify this thought process, at 7:14 local, shortly after their earlier failed attempt to land, the purser had entered the cockpit and engaged in a conversation with the flight crew, during which time he had suggested to the captain that a diversion to Delhi would be a significant burden on the operation. Whether his comment in isolation resonated with the captain is unclear, but subsequently he responded that the weather was improving and that they would be landing at Kathmandu. In his post-accident deposition, the captain claimed, despite what the CVR had suggested, that he was visual with the runway as the aircraft descended through the MDA. He stated that shortly after, he had momentarily lost visual contact, but before he could execute the missed approach, the runway environment once again reappeared through the fog. But again, evidence, this time in the form of data recovered from the flight recorder, told a different story. It conclusively proved that at the MDA the aircraft was higher than it should have been in relation to the runway threshold, and importantly, significantly to the left of centre. Surely had the captain been visual, as he had stated, presumably he would have noted this misalignment and made the necessary track correction in order to ensure a safe landing. But that hadn't happened. The evidence was fairly compelling, with the investigation team ultimately citing the captain's blind descent below the MDA, in contravention of established rules and regulation, as being the single most significant factor leading to the runway excursion. But there was still more to this story. In order to understand exactly how Turkish 726 found itself off the side of runway 02 at Tribhuvan, it's important to have an understanding of the type of approach the crew were attempting to fly, and importantly how local events at the airport that morning had conspired to influence that approach in a surprisingly negative way. As mentioned earlier, the accident crew have been cleared to fly the ORNAV approach. Such approaches, although not altogether new, have seen a huge surge in popularity over the recent past. As navigation accuracy is ensured by GPS and satellite communication, the approach's popularity, particularly from the airport operator's perspective, has been largely due to the fact that all relevant equipment necessary to complete the approach is actually carried on board the aircraft, negating the need to install and maintain expensive ground-based navigational aids. Additionally, the ORNAV approach brings with it a level of flexibility in its construction not experienced with traditional non-precision or ILS approaches. Such flexibility will allow for curved arcs to be built into the approach's construction, an immediate plus when viewed in the context of airports located in mountainous terrain, as indeed is the case with Tribhuvan. Historically, the traditional approach to Tribhuvan's runway 02 was the non-precision VOR approach, anchored on the Kathmandu VOR, located just to the south of the airfield. The term non-precision refers to the level of combined lateral and vertical accuracy the approach provides, with the signal output from the VOR stations generally being notoriously prone to interference and inaccuracy, meaning that two different aircraft flying the same approach are unlikely to fly the exact same lateral track over the ground, despite the fact that both may be well within the stipulated tolerances for the approach. That being the case, on arriving at the published minimum descent altitude, in this case 5,120 feet above mean sea level, geographically, both aircraft may well be in slightly different positions, such as the accepted inconsistency of the VOR approach. It's for this reason that the published minima for these types of approaches are set higher than their precision approach counterparts, as the expectation is that pilots will have to make some final visual adjustment to the aircraft's track in order to align it with the runway for landing, and hence earlier visual acquisition will be necessary. With regard to the vertical aspect of the VOR approach, only with the advent of the modern generation of flight management computers has the accuracy of these vertical profiles begun to emulate their precision approach cousins. Modern airliners such as the Airbus A330 now have the ability to manage these descent profiles automatically, relieving much of the pilot's workload. But still, these types of approaches come with an extra level of complexity not seen with the traditional precision ILS approaches. For example, with the ILS, the published glide slope providing vertical guidance all the way down to touchdown is set at a constant value, usually 3 degrees. However, looking closely at the vertical profile of the VOR approach to runway 02, you'll notice that in this particular instance, the descent gradient is constantly changing. For the 3-mile section between 13 and 10 miles, the procedure calls for a descent of 1,000 feet, from 10,500 to 9,500, the equivalent of 330 feet per mile travelled. Between 10 miles and 8 miles, the required descent is 1,300 feet, that being from 9,500 feet to 8,200 feet, the equivalent of 650 feet per mile travelled. The descent between 6 and 5 miles is a required 700 feet, while a similar distance of 1 mile between 5 and 4 miles requires only 300 feet of a descent. Such inconsistency again highlights some of the inherent weaknesses of this approach type, as the aircraft is compelled to descend in a straight line along the published inbound radial. Its ability to lose height is directly influenced by the height of the terrain underneath its path, and it is for this exact reason that the precision ILS approach can never be installed on this particular runway. Now look at the ORNAV alternative. The first noticeable difference is that the approach doesn't follow a straight line path from start to finish, but rather it avoids the highest of the terrain by meandering through the valley slightly to the left. Being able to avoid terrain in this manner means that the approach can be constructed with a continuous descent profile, somewhat akin to the ILS. although technically still referred to as a non-precision approach, the accuracy to which the aircraft can be guided is considerably greater than that of the VOR. In fact, such is the accuracy achieved that the aircraft will follow this combined lateral and vertical combination to a point exactly 50 feet above the runway threshold, again akin to where the ILS will ultimately bring the aircraft. And thus the minima published, although not quite as good as ILS figures, are nonetheless significantly better than those published for the VOR approach. Remember this fact, as it plays a significant role in explaining what actually happened to the accident flight. That being the case, the RNAV approach to runway 02 had heretofore terminated at a point 50 feet above the threshold, at a point co-located with the runway centerline. Specifically, that point on the threshold above which the target point had been set was identified as 27 degrees 41 minutes 2.007 seconds north, 85 degrees 21 minutes 12.215 seconds east. But, and this is a significant but, on January 1st, 2015, just over 2 months prior to the accident, the airport authorities had let it be known that work to extend the runway at the 02 end would shortly commence on the 5th of February. The notification stated that due to the nature of the works planned, it will be necessary to temporarily shift the runway threshold in a northerly direction by 120 metres. This temporarily displaced threshold was now defined as 27 degrees 41 minutes 6 seconds north, 85 degrees 21 minutes 13 seconds east. However, in publishing these revised coordinates, the airport authority had inadvertently made a huge oversight. A quick comparison between the before and after figures shows that something wasn't right. With the initial designation, the position of the reference threshold position has been defined in seconds of longitude and latitude to 4 decimal places. However, the methodology used to calculate the displaced coordinates was far less precise and rounded the seconds of longitude and latitude to the nearest whole number. Unbeknownst to anyone, although successfully displacing the threshold by the intended 120 metres, the rounding of the figures had also moved the reference point to the left off the runway centerline by a factor of 26 metres, not an insignificant amount. Thus the new revised target point for termination of the amended RNAV approach, as promulgated to the navigation database manufacturers, was geographically now 50 feet above this offset position. On January 29th, this initial notification was superseded by a second notification from the airport authority, correcting some errors in the first, but significantly, the position of the displaced threshold remained unchanged. A week later and 1 day before the works were due to commence, on the morning of February 4th, 2 notices were issued in quick succession, postponing the proposed works until March 5th. As that date arrived shortly beforehand on March 1st, now just 4 days before the accident, a follow-up notice again postponed the works until April 3rd, and finally, on April 1st, a final notice would cancel the works altogether. Why all this is important is that throughout this whole time, although no work on extending the runway had actually been undertaken, the information initially passed to the aircraft database manufacturers in relation to the displaced threshold had never been corrected. Thus, despite the fact that the entire runway length was available for use, the database updates, which had been incorporated into the flight management computer of Turkish 726, reflected an RNAV termination point not only much further into the runway than was necessary, but critically offset to a position which was no longer overhead the runway's paved surface at all. And without pilot interjection, this is where the aircraft will be guided to. Although the airport and Nepalese aviation authorities had failed to trap this coordinate error, telltale signs were there. On March 2nd, 2 days prior to the accident, the crew of another Turkish 330 had likewise executed the RNAV approach to runway 02. They had subsequently reported back to the airline that despite their accuracy and deviation parameters being absolutely correct, as the aircraft approached the minimum descent altitude, rather than being on the correct vertical profile and aligned with the runway centerline, it instead was visually high and to the left. In other words, this was proof positive that the aircraft was aiming for the displaced threshold position off to the side of the landing runway. Despite it being established that the incorrect threshold coordinates had been present in the onboard navigation database from the previous February 5th, almost a month earlier, investigators were satisfied that had visual contact with the runway been established by MDA, a satisfactory correction to the aircraft's track could have easily been made. Again, the fact that such a correction wasn't recorded on the flight data recorder was a strong suggestion that despite the captain's declaration to the contrary, he hadn't actually been visual at all. Well, at least until 5 seconds before touchdown. Visually, there were other telltale indications to the captain that the approach had reached a critical juncture. As the aircraft descended below the MDA, the flight mode annunciator on the primary flight display, which communicates to the pilot the current active autopilot modes, would have flashed a warning. Although the A330 is certified to execute an automatic landing, in other words, have the autopilot conduct the flare, touchdown and rollout, on completion of a precision ILS approach, the certification does not exist with regard non-precision approaches such as the ORNAV. Come what may, under such circumstances, the pilot and not the automation must perform the landing. That being the case in such circumstances, the 330 Flight Crew Operations Manual stipulates a minimum height above the ground for autopilot disconnection of 250 feet, and as was clearly recorded, disconnection occurred at a significantly lower height than that. Fixated on the task at hand, not just the captain, but both pilots had failed to acknowledge the rapidly changing circumstances around them, and in relying on the aircraft's automation to manage its descent while they desperately searched for the runway outside, had been blindsided to the autopilot's limitations. When visual contact was finally established, a mere 5 seconds before touchdown, the time available to observe, recognise and correct the latent database error and resultant misalignment was simply insufficient, meaning that the Turkish 726 was doomed to become yet another aviation statistic. With publication of the final report into the events surrounding Turkish Airlines Flight 726, the Nepalese Accident Investigation Commission in October 2015, some 7 months after the accident, stated the probable cause of the accident as being the decision of the flight crew to continue the approach and landing below the minimum descent altitude with inadequate visual reference, and their subsequent failure to perform a missed approach in accordance with the published approach procedure. In addition, they cited as contributing factors the probable fixation of the flight crew to land at Kathmandu and the deterioration of weather conditions that resulted in fog over the airport, reducing visibility below the required minima. From a personal perspective, I believe with respect that the Commission were remiss somewhat in their failure to acknowledge the database anomaly when citing what they perceived as contributing factors. I think it's fair to say that had the anomaly not existed, despite the assessment of crew non-compliance, with which I have absolutely no issue or conflict, the aircraft would have touched down, albeit unceremoniously, on the paved surface, and as such the runway excursion most probably would not have happened. In the accident's aftermath, Turkish Airlines established an internal unit whose focus was to be on quality control and navigation charts produced by external service providers. In tandem, a new procedure was introduced to check the validity of navigation databases, particularly in the context of ORNAV approaches. In relation to the specific ORNAV approach onto runway 02 at Tribhuvan, Turkish increased their own company visibility requirements from the stipulated 900 metres to 1800 metres. In light of the unique operational issues which Tribhuvan presents, the Flight Operations Department also introduced a policy whereby the normal crew complement for such flights would, in future, be augmented by an additional extra cockpit crew member. And finally, the scheduled arrival time for the winter operation was delayed by a number of hours in order to mitigate the possibility of operational disruption due to prevailing early morning fog at the airfield. And so concludes the story of Turkish 726. an example of the human's propensity when under stress to seek the path of least resistance, and the potential consequences such action can have.